Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Tool Belt Podcast, brought to you by Plant Services. I'm Tom Wilk, the Chief Editor of Plant Services, and today I'm speaking with Ron Brash, the Director of Cybersecurity Insights at Verve Industrial. We spoke a few weeks back on what's happening in the world of cybersecurity in the year 2021, and this conversation that took on a certain urgency as last year's data breach of the U.S. federal government came increasingly to light.
Okay, well, we'll start with the first question on the list, and especially in the U.S. here, everyone's focusing on the compromise of SolarWinds. It seems like if it's not one compromise, it's another, but this one really caught people's attention. And so cybersecurity is back on people's minds after a lengthy break focusing on COVID. So the question is, when the C-suite comes to visit maintenance and reliability, asking what they are doing right now to prevent or respond to cyber attacks, what, in your opinion, should maintenance and reliability be ready to say?
Well, excluding the SolarWinds part of that question, from a generic standpoint, and I'm saying this with tongue-in-cheek, of course, but the honest answer is we need help. There's no shame in asking for help, and I think most organizations, especially at the site levels, very rarely have I ever been at a site where the site overseer or the site manager has an inkling about what's going on the systems that are providing functionality to their process control. Like I said, very, very rarely. So I think there's no shame in asking for assistance and making it a collaborative effort, to be honest, especially if you inherit those assets, right? It's not your fault and you end up owning it, and it is what it is. And it's going to, of course, have some very uncomfortable conversations. But if your systems need improved networking investments that obviously can afford better security for today and tomorrow or reliability, ask for it by stating the business and security cases to do so. And I think that's also one of the barriers to these conversations in improving OT sites is IT is terrified of that land called OT, right? There's that kind of a joke where, there's Lion King where, Simba says to his dad, what's over there? And then the person responds, OT's over there. You must not go there, son, kind of conversation.
Right.
That's not what I'd wish on people, right? You need to be honest about it, and both groups need to talk about each other. So if your business is one of our customers is a very large top 6 pharmaceutical manufacturer, right? So their goal is to produce, things such as masks or saline bags, stuff like that, right? And that's their job. So if there's no saline bags being made, then the business isn't generating revenue. So you already have a relationship before you started. It's just about putting that into terms. Now, the ops team is going to say, well, my job is just to make sure the conveyor belts keep doing their thing and et cetera, et cetera. But the business side also needs to understand that a downtime equals them not being able to get their bonuses at the end of the year because they've had a disruption and then they've lost margins. So you automatically, you don't realize it, but you're already in bed together already. So it's best to communicate on terms that make sense. And I know engineers aren't very good at talking about those type of things in many cases, and some are, and vice versa. But being honest about the lack of security features or having, the processes and procedures to respond in a cyber-related event, especially if they know, they're not aware of it, they have no training, or maybe they're from a different generation or era where, things were very mechanical and analog. Being honest about things isn't bad, and also being, what's the best word here, but being, strong enough to say, I might not know about something, but taking proactive about it and, taking charge on it. Like, okay, I've been reading in my spare time, and, there's a different way. There's always two ways to say something. And one is you can be obstinate and say, we don't need help, or you can say, we need help, and I want to work with you on it. And it makes everyone open and friendly. So by doing that, I think generally management is aware that they incur liability and risk by not having security discussions. And in the past, M&R or whatever that business might use for that terminology hasn't been a part of those discussions. But if, as you say, in this case, the C-suite does come knocking on their door, then it's M&R's responsibility to make sure that the organization is adequately prepared to both manage the systems that are under their purview, but also to help engineer out the risks that affect the business for those same systems under their purview. So I think there's a good conversation that can be had there in a proactive way, and I don't think any C-suite or management would be avoidant in that discussion, because nowadays there's no excuse for C-suites and boards to not be aware of those issues. Now, I do recognize that saying that we need help sometimes might result in a few jobs being lost, don't get me wrong. But the idea of we need help, it shouldn't be a rear-end covering discussion. And the solution is not to get a checkbox. It's so M&R gets the visibility of their issues and their challenges up to the management level, and also by doing so, then being able to look for support by management to resolve those issues. So in my notes, I put I don't like the word convergent, but this is where worlds collide, right? If you can proactively find solutions collaboratively together, you're gonna fare well, at least in theory. And I found that at a personal level and in a business. So that's how I would look at it. In extension to that, some organizations might also have done good work in some areas, right? So if you've acquired some assets that were from a very mature organization, right, like you bought a site or a business unit, and then you inherited some other ones that aren't so good, there's a misconception when people talk about organizations as if they're homogenous, and that's not true. And business units are definitely not homogenous. I can think of many industrial vendors who make some very good products and some very not good products, and they're under very different business units or even acquired businesses. So M&R as a whole is not homogenous too. So it's important to look at individual concerns, not just looking at things holistically across the organization and say, oh, well, we're at a maturity level of this. No, that's not true, because your other risky assets potentially could be far less mature. And you might look at, some organizations look at things purely at a revenue generation capability, but that's not how it should be. So by having a discussion about where some of those risks are with management between that M&R conversation, management, yes, they may choose to completely sell off that set of assets because of an inherited risk. But also conversely, M&R might be in hot water if management finds out that M&R and management hadn't done their due diligence after an incident occurs because they have no insurance coverage. So It definitely would be a spicy conversation. So I think honesty and not just putting up walls is the best approach, but I think collaboratively taking down those walls in a divide and conquer fashion is the right way to go.
It's a really interesting take, because it aligns with one of the things we're hearing about maintenance reliability teams in general, especially maintenance, which is that you've got this veteran core that is slowly retiring. And over the past, say, 5-6 years, we've been following that workforce issue closely. And it looks like a lot of teams, they aren't giving up finding people, but I think they've realized that the time to have all knowledge that required to get the job done on your full-time staff may be over. And so they're very willing to partner out to fill these sort of areas where they would need support and need a partner to get things done. Are you seeing that too?
Yeah, I've seen that, and I'm not sure if it's for the right reasons. I mean, there's a lot of discussions about why certain systems can't be maintained easily anymore, right? Because those individuals have left, organizations, skeleton crews exist only, Bob or Jane might be dead. There's all sorts of theories on that and workforce issues. I know Alberta had some issues several years back where they had an aging workforce that was rapidly retiring, and they couldn't balance it out. It turns out they could get through those issues by increasing investments in automation and all of the things that supported that with a modernization. So I do think organizations will find solutions. I actually don't think there's a shortage of individuals for the workforce in general. I mean, this is a bit of an offshoot from that conversation. But I do think there's a shortage of capable individuals in general in today's society, and that is where the deficit is. Now, some people think when they go to university that makes them entitled. I don't. But what I do think is I saw an interesting strategy done by a very, very large airport in the UK, and I had some interesting discussions with a CISO there. And he was discussing about flight ops. And he said their average age of their security team for that airport was 23 years old. And I was like, wow, that's really young.
Interesting.
Right? Because, usually you finish your bachelor's at 23 years old or ish, plus or minus. Well, what he was saying was they went back to an old school way of apprenticeshiping. And they were picking up individuals, in their high school years, probably some sort of program with high schools. And they were getting individuals at 16, 17 years old and sort of training them as they're going through things. So they grabbed them earlier, and they were able to teach them the skills early on when they were far more flexible and maybe not poisoned by the educational system or by society. And so they actually overcame a lot of those obstacles, and they were able to get more knowledge in-house rapidly, cheaper, and through the investment of people. And I thought that was a very interesting take to balance some of those changes.
It is. It really is. Well, let me shift to a slightly more technical area, the discussion of these teams who are being asked to tie in OT into the cloud versus air gapping strategies, which a lot of our folks might be more familiar with. What are your thoughts on how people are balancing this trend to move more OT systems into the cloud, or at least network connected, versus air gapping?
Interesting. Okay, so I have a few takes on that, and hopefully they'll all make sense. There's a couple threads here. So in your question, you used the word balancing air gapping versus the benefits of keeping systems on-prem or in the cloud.
Right.
Balancing is an interesting choice of words because I don't think there actually is a balanced discussion going on consciously.
Okay.
I argue that the openness and interoperability of systems that was all the rage in the 80s and 90s is winning the battle because systems of today have changed, right? They didn't come with Ethernet cards back in the day. They had serial, or didn't even have that, right? They were on some sort of coaxial bus or something. And today they all, they all have IP addresses. So I think by de facto, that's just the way it is, right? When you go buy a car nowadays, it has Bluetooth. That's just the way it is. If you bought a car 10 years ago, it didn't have Bluetooth. I think it's a similar paradigm change, whether we like it or not. I think the cloud will come. I'm a bit of a pundit for saying let's not go to the cloud today, but I acknowledge that it's going to occur, and I do see the benefits of it. I do see there's an increase of interconnected systems, whether locally or in a distributed multi-site design. And I am seeing less and less islands. So clearly the air gapping strategy is going away because people are seeing it as more of a pain. And especially with COVID focuses on increasing revenue and decreasing costs, it makes sense that you would see that, right?
Right.
And that's not to say that everyone should get rid of all their islands. I think there is a place for islands, especially when you can't do anything about a particular type of system, or it's very, 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 very important that it maintains a certain level of integrity. You don't maybe want networking on it, right, if you're dealing with a safety instrumentation system. But generally I've found when people or organizations and sites use islands and even data diodes, they're using it as a cop-out for performing electronic maintenance. So, upgrades and patching of systems, right? They say, we got a diode, that's fine, leave it alone. We don't need that upgrade. That will just only cause us headaches. And so I do see when people look at using islands and diodes, they actually are promoting more negative behaviors that put the organization at risk. So what that means is often you'll see people put like a diode at the edge of a manufacturing cell. And then what will happen is, I need to get around that diode. And a diode is a one-way communication device. And you'll see people, what they'll do around that is I need to make changes. So I go over there with a transient laptop. Or I go with a USB stick to push updates and make changes. And this leads to unsafe behaviors and also control bypasses, right? So the concept of you put in a diode to control traffic, but I just went around it and I did all the bad things I shouldn't do. There's another risk there that if you follow that same design paradigm, you actually will wind up with an increased risk of a distributed infection. So what that means is, and if you're looking at the SolarWinds issue, there was basically a delayed fuse, right? It would wait for 14 or 15 days before it activated. That is a very common strategy in malware where, it goes in, it lays low, and then it comes to life. So if you have that same transient laptop go to all of your lines, it might wait and they all go down at the same time, and you would never have known that. So I do think there's a time and a place for air gapping, but there's risks of someone doing something they shouldn't be doing, or as a consequence of that security, convenience, and cost triangle. I think that needs to be balanced out in long term. Now, onto cloud and on-prem systems, many organizations, and especially processes, are not geared for these things. Sure, you can put telemetry, SAP, historians, logging servers, and maybe even some of your Microsoft Active Directory systems in the cloud, sure. But there's no way you can put physical inputs and outputs for, let's say, a conveyor belt or a stop or counters or whatever in the cloud. It will not work because it can't. Now, what I do think is hybrid or eventual cloud infrastructure will eventually arrive, but it will be a monolithic shift in infrastructure required to support that paradigm change. So, for example, I was in Japan last year as part of the U.S. Joint Warfare exercise, weirdly enough, as a Canadian. And so I met a bunch of creative individuals that were from ISA, International Society of Automation, and we went over there as part of as a kind of a group collective. And then there was also a gentleman you might know of, Andy from INL, Andy Bachman, and he's a well-known figure in the space. And so when we went over to Japan, they were discussing about how they were putting a big portion of their, or were planning to put a big portion of their OT infrastructure, especially the SCADA and monitoring aspects of it, into the cloud. And when you think about it, okay, you're like, wow, that's so far ahead of what North America is doing and potentially even parts of Europe. But there's a fundamental difference between North America and Japan, where Japan has fiber optics to everyone's curb. That is not the case in the United States, nor is it in Canada. And so, of course, you might think, well, that will come, but it won't. And the costs for doing so, especially with the price of broadband and communication, is really expensive. And so I don't see that coming quite so rapidly as it maybe would in the Asian countries, like Singapore, for example. It would make sense that they could do it, but maybe not us. So concurrently along those same lines, as a stopgap, I'm actually starting to see more and more virtualization at the site level. And to me, that is a fundamental change, not only for it being a stepping stone to the eventual cloud move, right? Because cloud virtualization, they're kind of the same. But B, it decreases physical hardware dependencies and promotes recovery and resiliency. And it also offers you digital twin testbed opportunities. And so as a hybrid shift to a cloud, or some people call it a fog, right? So it's an on-prem pseudo cloud thing. I see virtualization as that way to get to that. And I will continue to keep promoting that for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons actually is, let's say you have a Windows XP machine that doesn't require specialized hardware, but you still need Windows XP because of some ancient software that you're running. Well, virtualize it and tombstone the hardware, and now you get a whole bunch of things basically for free, right? Image restorations at midnight, on demand. You get so many things. And that I see is the big plus as starting to move towards that kind of hybrid on-prem cloudy thing, right? But there was having another discussion recently with Sarah Flukes from Admiria in Germany, and we were discussing about, besides this on-prem versus cloud thing, I do think many organizations will choose eventually to wish to have kept systems on-prem, at least virtualized or whatever, and even maybe essentially in the cloud, because that gives the organization, gives them back control away from the vendors. And that is something I think is going to be an interesting concept because of lock-in in the future. But if you tightly couple your systems, especially your process-related systems, to cloud components, you forgive your flexibility to choose when changes will occur. And so instead of, especially when OT makes very selective changes in investments for various reasons, but instead of making those selective changes in investments, you'll wind up with wholesale forklift changes. And that might work well for IT, where your lease of laptops comes up and everybody gets a new laptop every 3 years. You don't do that with turbines, and you don't do that with systems that control them, or you don't do that with a system, especially with systems that are high volume but low margin. You don't do those things. And so when you're dealing with OT, if you're not doing selective change, your change management, your budgeting, your scheduling of downtime, it's just not going to work for that mindset. And ultimately, I think if organizations are not able to secure systems locally, the move to the cloud is only going to put them at further risk. Even though it will be an eventuality, you're probably not ready for that change yet. So it's best to keep systems on-prem and secure them first, and then look at that transition later where it makes sense.
Okay. No, I appreciate the depth of that answer, because it really does chart out for our readers what the issues are in this area and what their options are, including virtualization as an emerging solution. Shifting to response plans, let's say when an incident does occur, the people I've talked to, they've been caught off guard by a phishing attack or some other attack that resulted in a ransomware situation. And people in some cases have raised their hands and said, yeah, they had to rebuild the server in some cases. So can you talk about the elements of a solid response plan to a cyber attack?
Sure. So let's say it was ransomware. No plan should have payment or ransom, period. It's bad, because you can't guarantee that the attacker won't come back and extort you further. So you should almost always expect to have a rebuild, and you should have processes around making a hastened rebuild de facto. Ransomware doesn't necessarily have to be about extortion as well. It can be about, or rather, an activity to hide or misdirect attention from other activities. So what you need to assume in a cyber-related incident, such as a phishing attack that delivers some sort of malicious payload, or ransomware that encrypts a system, you need to assume that asset, once compromised, it's toast. And so by toast, it doesn't necessarily mean that the hardware has to go into the destruction pile where you throw it into a vat of acid or bang it with sledgehammers so it sounds like a pair of maracas. It just means that in any event where the integrity of a system is directly affected, or the adjacent systems potentially are in question, you have to measure the potentiality of a compromised reoccurrence due to persistent access methods that an attacker might have placed on your system. So what that means is their intention might not have been just to ransom you. Their intention might have been for you to restore a backup, and that backup is infected potentially as well with something. So you need to do a little extra due diligence. From a general standpoint, though, a solid response plan expects the prerequisite of a well-defined and tested recovery and vulnerability management combo strategy, especially one that scales when under pressure. So rebuilding one system at a time isn't a big deal, but rebuilding a whole bunch of systems at a time, at any given time, especially when you're under pressure, that's the bigger issue here. It's not uncommon for me to say, or to hear some site manager say, or a site technician say, "Oh, I just rebuilt a system a while back because the hard drive failed." This isn't much different than that. The only difference is that they probably had other systems up and running and covering that system, right? So, but when you deal with ransomware, or even a hardware failure, you need to do a recovery. But when it is malware related, surely it's probably going to affect more than a single system. And generally, you're going to need to rapidly correct the flaws that allowed the attacker in. You're going to need to archive the system images for forensics and posterity, at least. You're going to have to restore and update software. You're going to have to reset credentials. And then you're going to ultimately have to get things operational. But nonetheless, though, all of those things I just mentioned are capable or are good opportunities for proceduralization, for testing, end-to-end of those procedures and the people. But also they're enforceable through drills ahead of an incident, right? I don't know how often you've been to a site, But, every Wednesday at 2 o'clock or whatever, you often will have a fire drill or a fire system test. This is no different. And if people started looking at cyber as just one of the things that they have to deal with, like a system failure, and treated it as such, then you're going to get all the benefits out of it, and you're going to be able to recover faster. A friend of mine once, you might even know her, Megan Sanford, who's now at Schneider Electric. She once said to me, $1 up front in emergency planning can save $4 later. Now, I know she took that from some study somewhere, but it's very true. And this is something that, any manager or a person responsible for M&R should be at least conscious of, right? Because, there's proactive things you do. Restoring pumps or replacing pumps or impellers. You do those things at certain runtime hours, and you plan for a failure. That's just part of what you do. But all the while, I think there's an important piece there of a response strategy is organizations in the past have made some big oopses. And they made some of those big oopses by allowing IT security to manage the recovery efforts, especially when you're operationalizing a plant. And if you don't have operations as a key driving force, in cases where you have SRP, what I call safety, reliability, and productivity, and you don't have those ops people driving it, you're going to basically wind up with cases where you could actually put health and safety at risk, but also wind up with a delayed recovery. So you need to keep those people involved, and that's good news. But ultimately, as I said also, when systems fail, they don't fail one at a time in a ransomware type attack. They fail several at a time. And so you also need to make sure that whatever your recovery strategy is, it can scale to multiple systems at once. So that might mean multiple people. That might mean automation technology. But it also means do you have the network bandwidth to restore several systems at once too. So it's a bit different than everyone else says when they think of just a process. It's a bunch of things, and you need to really stress test it. But I know what I'm saying sounds like a lot, but I think there's an important piece here. Ransomware is the attack of today. Viruses, in their traditional sense, were an attack of, the early 2000s. But if you were to plan for virus recovery in the 2000s, you're probably going to be pretty well recovered for ransomware today. So what that's telling you is many of those elements I'm talking about are reusable, and you can also maintain them for other events. It's not a cost sink. It's something that can be leveraged for any cyber-related incident, whether it's a physical failure or not, or a cyber disaster, such as a wholesale ransomware fire sale. But the strategies that we're talking about may also carry forward for physical disaster recovery, such as fires and floods, where you lose you lose something, wholesale, and you need to recover rapidly in the future to start generating revenue again. So I think there's also a positive there that if you didn't have those things in place yesterday, you can benefit from them for today and also for tomorrow in many, many instances. And that's something I think most cyber people don't think about.
Okay. That's a really good point. It lines up with a lot of the way our readers think about their regular PM routes. If they're going to check the pump and, again, replace the pump either on based on usage or based on some other timeline, there's a parallel there in building in system checks in much the same way.
Sorry to interrupt you, but most organizations already have processes, as you said, and so tagging in cyber in there and piggybacking them isn't a big deal to me. Yeah. That's how I look at it. It's just a modification effort and also a testing effort as well.
And this is just a hunch on my part based on some conversations I've had, but I would think that newer workers to this field, especially the under 30s, would be surprised if there wasn't this kind of process in place for cyber, given that we've got the digital generation now entering the workforce, and so PMs without those kind of aspects would raise eyebrows.
You think that, and I would surmise something similar, but I've been to a few facilities where a lot of engineers, around my age or around that 30 age, they didn't learn these concepts in school. And they don't, for some reason, I don't know why they don't maybe have the common sense, although I guess if I have to question common sense, it's probably not common. But they don't seem to have that awareness unless maybe they've read it, they heard about it in the news, maybe they think it's someone else's problem. I don't know. But that also demonstrates that there's an issue with the educational system where these elements are being left out of the curriculum. And so for publications such as yourself or for engineering institutions and associations and all of those things, they also too need to help their members be aware of the right things and also to bring those questions into organizations. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done there too.
All right. Well, let's move to the last question then, which is really on supply chain. We've got a lot of supply chain professionals who lead plant services, and the COVID-19 has been testing supply chain resiliency around the world, and there's a parallel there in the way that cyberattacks test the resiliency of industrial network systems. Would you say that the supply chain in general has passed the stress test of COVID-19? And sort of related, how vulnerable do you think the supply chain is these days to cyberattacks?
Sure. So a lot of that's dependent on where you are in the world and what you need, right? I would, and then excluding software supply chain, so that's another issue altogether. But if you're asking, what is the test and what are the measurements on it, so I kind of converted it to a GSBF, good, satisfactory, barely, or fail ranking system. And so if I were to use that same scale, I believe depending on where you are and what that chain is, we are at the line between barely and satisfactory in terms of this the results that we see, right? In other words, I order my package, it arrives at my door. Or, there's food in the grocery store, so I guess it's okay, right? There might be delays, but I guess it's okay. Or maybe, the stock isn't quite as up to par as it should be. Now, for essentials, it seems that the big organizations are pulling through this, but there's a cost, I think. People get tired, people get sick, and systems break. So for those of us that have been around, cars, you don't run a car at red line for an extended period of time because things will quickly degrade and degrade at a rate that was much quicker than anticipated, and eventually things will get hot and fail or break, right? So I suspect that as this, the lockdowns keep occurring and people get tired and stuff like that, or maybe you skip a maintenance cycle because you're trying to churn out as much toilet paper or personal health and protection and safety devices, things are going to start to break sooner than later because of that. Or what will happen is we'll get through this outage, and then because we've skipped all those maintenance cycles, a whole bunch of bad things and catastrophic failures are going to occur after the fact. Right. So I think while operations are still occurring, reasonably well, even though it's at a reduced level, and we're getting our packages, I think we're missing the behind-the-scenes part. And before COVID, most industrial process equipment in general was poorly protected. And it was designed also on a model that was for previous generations, but doesn't work well in a modern digital age. So, for example, if we're talking about electronic system maintenance, generally there's a mindset of if it's not broke, don't fix it. Or better yet, people thought of a concept of multiple redundant lines would help you in a physical failure event. But if you look at things from an electronic perspective, when something goes sideways, and surely it will, there is zero technological diversity in place to prevent all of the manufacturing unit cells or lines from being brought down by a single weaponized approach that would target all lines, right?
Right.
So I do think the whole system is very, very fragile. And if, an HSE, a health, safety, and environment event occur, was it your biggest nightmare? Right now you're playing cyber roulette, even though it looks like you're still getting your packages. So that's kind of how I think about it. I think it's working, but I do think that we're going to incur future costs as an unintended consequence, especially for maintenance. So to summarize up what I'm trying to say, I guess it's like we are in a fragile state. And as the expression goes, I once heard, if you hold too many books at once, and especially when someone adds one more to the pile, then you drop the ball. And I fear that if we are over-reliant on these book carriers, who may be few and far in between, especially as organizations focus on decreasing overhead and focus on revenue generation, I think when a few of those links in the chain start to snap or be fatigued, the whole system or parts of the system will collapse. And so that's kind of my mindset on it. I do think we haven't done enough to promote resiliency with respect to industrial control systems and operational technology. But that's just my sense from all of the sites I've ever been to.